A woman in the seventh row stood up slowly, reached into the bag at her feet, and walked toward the stage. She did not rush. She moved the way people move when they have been carrying something for a very long time and have finally decided the weight is not theirs to keep. In her hands was a small box, wooden, the size of a hardback book, worn smooth at the corners from years of handling. She carried it in both hands, held slightly away from her body, the way you carry something that belongs to someone else. Jimmy Fallon saw her coming and did not speak. He stood up from his desk, his eyes filled. He had known this moment was coming. He had planned it himself, in complete secrecy, over 4 months, and still he was not ready for it. Tears were streaming down his face by the time she reached the steps at the edge of the stage, and he was not trying to stop them, not even slightly. 300 people in that studio had gone completely, entirely silent. The woman who walked toward that stage was Alicia Houston Garland. She was 58 years old. She was not famous. She was not a performer. She was a retired music teacher from Newark, New Jersey, who had spent her whole life in the quiet shadow of the most extraordinary voice the 20th century produced. She was Whitney Houston's younger sister, and what she was carrying in that wooden box had never been heard by anyone in the world except her. It was a Thursday night taping. September 2023. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. The occasion was the 11th anniversary tribute to Whitney Houston, a segment the show had been planning for months. There were clips, there were guest tributes. There was a full band arrangement of I Will Always Love You performed by a gospel choir that brought the audience to their feet. It was a beautiful evening, warm and reverential, exactly the kind of tribute that a voice like Whitney Houston's deserves. Careful, serious, full of love. And then, between segments, Jimmy Fallon looked into the camera and said, "Before we close tonight, there is someone in this audience I would like to introduce. Someone who has never spoken publicly about her sister. Someone who agreed to be here tonight for one reason, and one reason only." He paused. His voice was already unsteady. "Alicia," he said, "would you come up?" The seventh row was not close to the stage. It took her a moment to stand, to collect the wooden box from under her seat, to make her way through the row of people who shifted aside to let her pass. The studio was so quiet that the sound of her footsteps on the floor was audible all the way to the back of the room. Not loud, not dramatic, just a sound. Unhurried, certain, the sound of someone who has made up her mind. She reached the edge of the stage, and Jimmy Fallon came down the 3 steps to meet her. The way you go to meet someone when asking them to come to you feels like too much to ask. He took her hand. He could not speak. 300 people held their breath. The entire studio froze. People looked at the wooden box in her hands. What was inside it? Was it a recording? A letter? Something private? Something final? Something that had been kept in a quiet house in Newark for 11 years, waiting for the right moment to be released into the world? The questions moved through the audience in the dark, unspoken and urgent, and then Alicia Houston Garland looked out at 300 strangers and said, in a voice that was steady and clear and completely composed, the voice of a woman who had been preparing this moment for a very long time, "My sister gave me something the week before she died. She told me I would know when it was time to share it. I think tonight is the time." She set the wooden box on Jimmy Fallon's desk. She opened it. Inside, resting in a small bed of dark velvet, was a cassette tape. White plastic housing, black label. Written on it in Whitney Houston's own handwriting, in the purple pen she always used, were 4 words. "For when you're ready." Jimmy Fallon looked at those 4 words and could not speak. 300 people in the dark looked at those 4 words and could not speak. And Alicia Houston Garland stood at the desk of The Tonight Show and said, "I have been ready for 11 years. I just needed to find the right place to let her be heard one more time." To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1979. Because Whitney Houston was not always the Whitney Houston the world came to know. She was, before any of that, just a 15-year-old girl from Newark, New Jersey, who sang in the choir at New Hope Baptist Church and had not yet understood what she had. In the summer of 1979, Whitney Houston was 15 years old, and her sister Alicia was 13. And they shared a bedroom in the family's home on Dodd Street in Newark with a window that faced the back alley and a portable cassette recorder on the dresser that their mother had bought at a second-hand store for $7. The recorder was used for many things: homework, radio programs, the occasional family joke recorded and played back to general hilarity, but mostly, that summer, it was used by Whitney. She sang into it alone, late at night, after everyone else was asleep. Not the gospel songs she sang in church. Not the pop songs she practiced for school talent shows. Something else. Songs she was writing herself, in a notebook she kept under her pillow. Melodies she had never sung for anyone. Words she was still working out. Arrangements she was building in her head with no instrument except her own voice, laying down each part separately and then playing them back together to hear how they fit. Alicia knew about the recordings. She shared the room. She pretended to be asleep, night after night, and listened through what she later described as the most extraordinary experience of her childhood. Lying in the dark in a room in Newark, 13 years old, listening to her sister invent herself. One night in August 1979, Whitney played back a song she had just recorded and sat on the edge of her bed and listened to it with her eyes closed. When it ended, she rewound the tape and played it again. And then she noticed Alicia was awake. She didn't say anything about being caught. She just held the recorder out and said, "Come listen." Alicia crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed, and they listened to the playback together. A 15-year-old girl's voice in a bedroom in Newark at 2 a.m, singing a song about their grandmother who had died the previous spring. A song that was not finished and would never be finished, and was perfect exactly as it was. When it ended, neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Whitney said, "That one's for you. You're the only one who gets to have that one." She ejected the tape from the recorder and wrote Alicia's name on the label in purple pen and handed it to her. Not as a gesture. Not sentimentally. Simply as a fact. The song was Alicia's because Alicia had been there when it was born, and that was how ownership worked in the Houston household for things that mattered. Alicia kept that tape for 44 years. Through her own life, her marriage, her career as a music teacher, her children, her grandchildren. Through the years of watching her sister become something the world had never quite seen before, a voice so perfect it seemed almost unfair. A talent that made people feel they were in the presence of something that could not have arrived by accident. Through the grief that came on February 11th, 2012, in a hotel room in Beverly Hills, the grief that does not end, that a person simply learns to carry differently as time goes on. The tape stayed in a cedar box in her bedroom closet. She never played it, for anyone. She never described what was on it. When journalists and documentarians and well-meaning friends asked about Whitney over the years, she answered gently and generally, and kept the specific private. Some things belonged to a bedroom in Newark at 2 a.m, and the public world was not that room. Then, in the spring of 2023, Alicia's granddaughter, a 12-year-old named Destiny, who had discovered Whitney Houston's music on her own, through a streaming service, the way this generation discovers everything, and had come to her grandmother trembling with the excitement of someone who has just found something enormous, asked her, "Grandma, did you know her? Did you really know her?" And Alicia Houston Garland looked at her 12-year-old granddaughter's face and understood that the answer to that question deserved more than words. She called her son that evening. She told him to find someone at The Tonight Show. She said, "I have something Whitney gave me. I want to play it once, in public, somewhere worthy of it. And then I want to give the tape to a place that will keep it safe, not to be sold, not to be owned, just to be kept. I want people to know this version of her existed, the one before the world got her." The Tonight Show's producers called her back within 48 hours. Jimmy Fallon called her personally the following week, and then 4 months of planning, of secrecy, of a wooden box being carried from Newark to New York on a Thursday morning in September, of Alicia Houston Garland sitting in the 7th row of the Tonight Show studio with something in her hands that she had carried for 44 years and was finally, completely, ready to set down. Behind the scenes, Jimmy Fallon had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He had insisted, over the objections of 2 senior producers who wanted to build a formal segment around the reveal, with graphics and a voiceover introduction and carefully placed camera angles, that the moment happened simply. A woman standing up from the audience. A wooden box. The tape. Nothing more. No packaging. No framing. Just the truth of what it was. "I don't want to produce it," he had told them in the planning meeting. "I want to witness it. There is a difference." The sound engineers had been briefed. A reel-to-reel conversion of the cassette had been made weeks earlier, transferred to digital by a specialist in audio restoration who had wept quietly at his workstation while doing it. And that digital transfer was now loaded into the studio's sound system, ready to play through the Tonight Show's speakers at full quality the moment Jimmy gave the signal. The original cassette was in the wooden box. The wooden box was in Alicia's hands. That was all anyone in that studio needed to know. Alicia had not told her granddaughter Destiny what was going to happen that night. She had only told her that something important was going to be on television and that she should watch it with her parents. Destiny was at home in Newark on a school night, in her pajamas, watching The Tonight Show for the first time in her life. Now the studio understood. The wooden box. The cassette tape in purple pen. The 44 years of careful keeping. The 13-year-old girl lying awake in a shared bedroom in Newark in 1979, listening to her sister invent herself in the dark. The song that had never been finished. The song that was perfect as it was. Jimmy Fallon looked at Alicia Houston Garland standing beside his desk and found that he still could not speak at full volume. He managed one sentence. He said it quietly, to her and not to the audience, though the microphone caught it perfectly. "Are you ready?" She looked at him. She said, "I have been ready since I was 13 years old." He nodded to the sound booth, and Whitney Houston's voice filled the Tonight Show studio. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. It was not what anyone expected, not a power ballad. Not the voice at full throttle, the voice everyone knew, the voice that had made a generation understand what a human instrument could do when it was used without reservation. It was something smaller than that. Quieter, a girl's voice, 15 years old, singing in a bedroom in Newark at 2 a.m. And the song was about her grandmother, and about the specific grief of losing someone who knew you before the world did. And the melody was simple and slightly unfinished in the way that the most honest things are unfinished, and there was cassette hiss audible beneath every note, and the room in Newark was audible too. a car passing outside, a creak of the bed, the faint sound of the city at night coming through the window. It lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Not one person in that studio moved. Jimmy Fallon was crying before the first chorus. He stood beside his desk with tears streaming down his face and his hands clasped in front of him, and he did not try to compose himself, because composure was not what this moment required. Questlove had set his sticks across his snare in a gesture of stillness. The gospel choir, still assembled at the back of the stage from the earlier tribute, stood without moving, many of them with their hands over their hearts. 300 strangers in the dark listened to Whitney Houston at 15 years old sing a song about her grandmother that she had never intended for any of them, and the studio was the most silent room in New York City for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. When the recording ended, it ended the way it had begun, abruptly, the tape simply stopping, the way recordings stop when the person making them reaches forward and presses the button and the machine goes quiet and the room comes back. Alicia Houston Garland reached into the wooden box and lifted out the cassette tape. She held it for a moment. Then she turned to Jimmy Fallon and placed it in his hands. Both hands, the way you transfer something irreplaceable, making sure the other person has a firm hold before you let go. She asked me to give this to someone who would make sure people could always hear it, Alicia said, her voice steady and quiet and completely without performance. She said, "Find someone who understands that some voices are not meant to be owned, just heard." Jimmy Fallon looked down at the cassette tape in his hands. The purple pen, the 4 words. He tried to speak. The first attempt produced nothing. The second attempt produced 1 sentence, barely above a whisper, and his voice broke on the last word. "We will take care of it," he said. "I promise." Alicia Houston Garland nodded. Then she did something no one had anticipated. She turned to face the audience, 300 people on their feet now, the applause beginning low and rising, the way certain kinds of grief and gratitude rise together, and she said, clearly, so that everyone in the room could hear, "She loved you all. She wanted you to know that. Even when it was hard, she loved giving you what she had." The applause became something that was no longer just applause. It was the sound of 300 people who had grown up with a voice that had been present at every important moment of their lives, their weddings, their heartbreaks, their drives home at midnight, trying to say thank you to the only person in the room who could receive it on Whitney's behalf. Alicia stood in it for a long moment. Then she sat back down in the 7th row, folded her hands in her lap, and let it wash over her. The cassette tape was transferred to the permanent collection of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. in January of 2024. In a small ceremony attended by the Houston family and a handful of music historians. It is stored in a climate-controlled archive alongside the artifacts of the other voices that shaped American music in the 20th century. The digital transfer was released publicly in February 2024, on the 12th anniversary of Whitney Houston's death, as a free stream available to anyone in the world. In the first 24 hours, it was listened to 41 million times. Destiny, who had watched The Tonight Show taping in her pajamas in Newark, heard her great-aunt's name called from the 7th row and understood for the first time that some of what she loved had a face she already knew. She asked her grandmother the next morning what the song had been called. Alicia told her it had never had a title, that Whitney had never gotten around to naming it, that sometimes the most important things are the ones that stay just slightly unfinished. Destiny said, "Can I name it?" Alicia said yes. She named it For When You're Ready. The voices we keep for ourselves are not lesser than the ones we give to the world. Sometimes they are the truest ones, The ones that proved the gift was real before anyone was watching.